Ever since Gypsy Rose got out of prison a few weeks ago, I've been thinking about who's next. Like, who is the next high-profile murderer that they're going to release from prison? So I did some research, and I've narrowed it down to 3 people. We've got a woman that triggered a nationwide manhunt by lying to the police, a notorious serial killer who, quite honestly, is one of the most terrifying people I've ever read about, and this first guy, who committed one of the most infamous murders of the last 100 years.
As you heard Dr. Stephen Lynn at Roosevelt Hospital in New York City say, Lennon was shot and killed at about 11 o'clock last night.
December 8th, 1980. John Lennon had just made his return to music after a 5-year-long hiatus. The album Double Fantasy was criticized pretty heavily when it first came out, but it ended up becoming a massive commercial success because it was the very last album that Lennon ever recorded. That particular day, he had a couple different appointments to go to. An afternoon photo shoot with world-renowned photographer Annie Leibovitz, an interview with RKO Radio Network, and finally a mixing session for a song with his wife, Yoko Ono. As they left their apartment to go to the recording studio, Lennon was immediately bombarded by a crowd of fans, all waiting outside the building. This kind of thing happened pretty much every single time Lennon left his apartment, but he didn't mind stopping, signing a few autographs, taking a few pictures. After all, they were clearly die-hard fans. Why else would they be waiting outside in the cold all day, right? At around 10:50 p.m., Lennon and Yoko Ono finally got back from the recording studio. They planned to go and grab some dinner over at the Stage Diner, but they wanted to go and say goodnight to their son first. As they got out of the car, they walked towards the courtyard of the apartment, and a man started following close behind them. Suddenly, he pulled a revolver out of his coat pocket and fired 5 rounds straight into John Lennon's back. Lennon stumbled towards the lobby of the apartment, yelling, "I'm shot! I'm shot!" He stumbled and fell to the floor as blood was pouring out of his mouth. Meanwhile, the doorman wrestled the gun away from the shooter and screamed, "Do you know what you just did?" And the shooter calmly replied, "I just shot John Lennon."
Give Miami no opportunity whatsoever. Timeout is called. 3 seconds remaining. John Smith is on the line, and I don't care what's on the line, Howard. You have got to say what we know in the booth.
Yes, we have to say it. Remember, this is just a football game, no matter who wins or loses. An unspeakable tragedy confirmed to us by ABC News in New York City. John Lennon, outside of his apartment building on the west side of New York City, the most famous perhaps of all of the Beatles, shot twice in the back, rushed to Roosevelt Hospital, dead on arrival.
That was the very first public announcement of John Lennon's death. I've been trying to imagine what it must have felt like to hear that live when it happened. Like, even if you weren't a fan of the Beatles, that is a cultural icon. That is shocking news, especially because there was so little information at the time. Lennon had literally just died in the hospital moments before that went out over the air. The only people that actually knew who the killer was were the cops that had him in the back of their patrol car. But by the very next day, the entire world knew his name. Mark David Chapman. This was the man that had assassinated John Lennon. But even before that, his life was a constant roller coaster of ups and downs. When I was researching this case, I was reading things about Mark that made me go, okay, yeah, I can see how he ended up where he did. But then immediately after, I would read some things and think to myself, this cannot be the same guy. And I think you'll feel that way too. Just let me explain. In high school, Mark was the target of incessant bullying. In order to cope with that, he started experimenting with drugs, mainly hallucinogens, psychedelics, heroin. And on top of that, his home life wasn't really much better. Apparently, Mark was afraid of his dad, a staff sergeant in the Air Force that he claimed was abusive towards his mother, both physically and emotionally. Years later, he confided in a psychologist saying that he thought about killing his dad just to help his mom escape that awful situation that she was in. So clearly, even from a young age, Mark was battling some demons. This is the I can see how we ended up here version of Mark. But by the time he turned 16, it seemed that he had been able to start turning his life around. He got a girlfriend, became a born-again Presbyterian, and even got a job as a camp counselor at the local YMCA. No one that he worked with at the Y could imagine him growing up to become this killer. He was easily the favorite counselor among the kids and the staff, got promoted to assistant director, and even won an award for being an outstanding counselor. The executive director at the time said, quote, "If there was ever a person who had the potential for doing good, it was Mark." That's the part that I read and I go, this can't be the same guy. And it must be 10 times worse for the people that actually knew him. Clearly, all of them thought that he had a good heart until all this happened. Eventually, Mark graduated high school and enrolled in Covenant College with his girlfriend. At the time, it seemed like everything was going perfect, but Mark would eventually look back on this time and say, this was the part of his life where things went to a tailspin. It started with his academics. He just couldn't seem to stay on track in any of his courses, and as he fell further and further behind, he said that he felt like a failure. Thoughts of taking his own life started to cross his mind. He went into this manic depression, and as if things couldn't get any worse, his girlfriend Jessica decided to break up with him, even after he had followed her to college to be with her. Mark ended up dropping out of college after just one semester. And over the next few years of his life, there were just so many drastic ups and downs. At 21, he moved to Hawaii to try and start a new life, but within months of being there, he was admitted to a hospital for clinical depression after a failed attempt at taking his own life. After that, he traveled around the world for 6 straight weeks, ended up marrying his travel agent, and then returned to Hawaii and got a job at the same hospital that he was previously admitted at. That didn't last very long though, and he was fired from that job. He ended up getting a new job as an armed security guard at a luxury apartment complex, but that just caused him to slip into a deep depression, which he started to cope with by drinking. By late 1980, Mark was 25 years old, and his mental state had only gotten worse. He was in this severe depression. But over the years, no matter what the ups and downs, Mark always had 2 constant obsessions. One was the book, The Catcher in the Rye, and the other was former Beatles member John Lennon. His obsession with Catcher in the Rye was out of love. He really wanted to model himself off the main character in that book. But his obsession with John Lennon, that one was based off of pure hatred. As a born-again Presbyterian, Mark was disgusted by the comments that Lennon made about the Beatles being more popular than Jesus. He also didn't see how such a wealthy man who lived so lavishly was able to preach in his music about peace, love, and equality for all people, particularly in the songs Imagine and God. Like the main character from Catcher in the Rye, Mark said that he couldn't stand hypocrites. For years, he had despised Lennon from afar, but he was finally going to take matters into his own hands. According to him, he was going to make something of himself. And we all know what happened next.
Good evening. The death of a man who sang and played the guitar overshadows the news from Poland, Iran, and Washington tonight. Former Beatle John Lennon, who was 40, was shot and killed last night outside his luxury apartment in New York. The alleged killer is an unemployed security guard and printer who had lived in Hawaii. News of Lennon's death touched off a wave of shock and mourning around the world.
This might actually be one of the most ominous photos ever taken. We showed it earlier in the video as a bit of foreshadowing, but that is John Lennon signing an autograph for his killer, Mark David Chapman. This happened just hours before he was murdered. He was one of the people that was waiting outside the apartment when they went over to the recording studio. Really eerie in hindsight, super eerie. Mark eventually pleaded guilty to the second-degree murder charge, and a judge sentenced him to 20 years to life in prison. Now, the way the law works in New York, because Mark has served 20 years, he is going to go ahead and get a parole hearing every 2 years from now until he literally dies, if that's the case, right? So he's had 12 now since the year 2000. This one coming up will be the 13th, and it's going to be sometime in February. They haven't set a date yet, at least not publicly. Personally, I don't think 13th time is going to be the charm for Mark, but I'm going to let you all decide what you think while we move on to our next case, which is about a woman that's having her very first parole hearing later this year. October 25th, 1994, Union, South Carolina. Susan Smith is driving around with her 2 young sons in the backseat of her car. It's around 8 p.m. and they're heading over to see a friend of hers. When she comes to a red light, she turns around to check on the boys. They're looking a little sleepy. After all, it was kind of late for 2 young kids. But they're about to be wide awake, because as Susan turned back around, a man jumped in the passenger seat of the car, pressed a gun to her temple, and told her to drive. They made it a few miles outside county lines before he threw her out the driver's side door, and drove off with the kids still in the back seat. The story made headlines and led to a nationwide manhunt. But little did everyone know that the real culprit was in front of them the whole time.
More than 8 days since Susan Smith claims a carjacker stole her 2 babies. What everyone hoped would be a joyous appearance by Susan and David Smith becomes yet another anguished plea.
I would like to say to whoever has my children that they please bring them home to us where they belong.
So at the time this story takes place, Susan Smith is 23 years old. And even though she was so young at the time, she had already been through a lot in her life, like a lot of very traumatic events. I've gone through a lot of the information about her past, all the stuff leading up to this case, and I'm going to condense it all down for you into life events and the effects of those life events. Let's start with her home life. Her parents had a very strained relationship. There was a lot of fighting between them, accusations of infidelity, people not being faithful, and all of that kind of culminates in her parents getting divorced by the time that she's 6 years old. Right after that happens, her father ends up taking his own life, which these two events right in succession with each other are a lot to deal with, especially for somebody as young as 6 years old. Now, her mom did end up getting remarried pretty soon after that to a guy that she thought would be a good stepfather, and for a while he was. But when Susan turned 16, that stepfather ended up assaulting her, taking advantage of her. So what are the effects of all of these events in Susan's life so far? Well, for one, she ended up trying to take her own life twice by the time she was 18 years old. Probably a combination of the trauma she endured and undiagnosed mental illness. She also had issues with commitment, as her parents were divorced and constantly fighting about infidelity, and complicated relationships with men, particularly older men. One specific example is that she ended up getting into a relationship when she was a senior in high school with this guy that she worked with who was much older than her and married. Now, at the same time, she was in a relationship with a much younger guy as well, and when those two people found out what she was doing, they broke it off with her. When Susan did end up getting married, it was to another one of her coworkers, a guy named David Smith. But at the time that they got married, David was actually already engaged to another woman. Again, you're seeing these issues with commitment and complicated relationships with men popping up pretty consistently. In the time that they were together, Susan and David's relationship was far from perfect. They ended up having 2 children together, but even that wasn't enough to keep them committed to each other. They were constantly on and off, separated, unseparated, seeing other people even when they were supposed to be together. All of this culminated with Susan and her husband getting a divorce in September of 1994. Just a couple months before the kids were kidnapped. Now, when they did go missing, Susan and David got back together. They wanted to show they were united in the mission of bringing their children home. But just like all of the other times that they had gotten back together, this one wasn't going to last. When Susan first talked to the police, she was able to give them a description of the man that carjacked her, and they came up with this composite sketch. It ended up being posted everywhere, but nobody in Union County could recall seeing somebody that looked like that. She also gave them a full breakdown of her story, how she was driving to meet up with a friend, how she was carjacked while she was at the red light, how the perp dropped her off outside county lines and drove away with her kids still in the back. Once the story was released to the public, it didn't take long for it to spread across the nation. Media descended upon Union County in South Carolina, and suddenly, Susan was in front of every TV camera, pleading for help in bringing her sons home. But behind the scenes, police were skeptical of Susan's story. For one, they had talked to that friend that Susan was supposedly meeting up with, and according to him, he had no recollection of Susan planning to come over. In fact, he wasn't even at the house when all of this happened. Susan also mentioned that she was at a Walmart earlier that night with her sons, but not a single witness, employee, or customer could remember her actually being there. They ended up bringing in Susan for a polygraph test, which I feel the need to mention is not the most accurate way to tell if somebody is lying. Regardless, when she was asked, "Do you know where your children are?" her deception levels were just off the charts. Between the interview with her friend, the witness reports from the Walmart, and the polygraph test, there was a lot of damning evidence against Susan. But she continued to deny that she had anything to do with her children's disappearance. It wasn't until about a week later that a giant hole was revealed in her story. And not by police, but by a maintenance worker.
Well, actually, I have to give credit to a maintenance man in the area who knew that the traffic light, where she says the kidnap occurred, doesn't turn red if there's no cars at the intersection. It's always green. And she was saying that she was stopped there, and that's where she was kidnapped. And so when I confronted her with that, I finally got the truth out of her.
And the truth was that Susan had murdered her 2 children. You see, while she was in the process of getting divorced from her husband, she started seeing this other guy named Tom Finlay. And she really thought that this guy was the one, the person that was finally going to give her some stability in her life, the person that was going to make her happy. She had hoped that once the divorce was finalized, they could be together officially, get married. But Tom just didn't feel the same way about Susan. He actually sent her a letter shortly before her kids disappeared. And it's a long letter too, several pages, like 1,500 words. But I've picked out what I think are the most important parts, the ones that'll help you understand how Susan got where she is today.
Dear Susan, this is a difficult letter for me to write because I know how much you think of me. You will, without a doubt, make some lucky man a great wife. But unfortunately, it won't be me. Even though you think we have much in common, we are vastly different. Like I've told you before, there are some things about you that aren't suited for me. And yes, I am speaking about your children. I'm sure that your kids are good kids, but it really wouldn't matter how good they may be. The fact is, I just don't want children, and I don't want to be responsible for anyone else's children either. Again, you will always have my friendship, and your friendship is one that I will always look upon with sincere affection. Tom.
After reading all that, Susan just felt like she didn't have anything left to live for. She drove out to John D. Long Lake with her kids in the backseat of her car, sleeping soundly. She pulled up to the edge of the water, and her original plan was for all 3 of them to die together by just letting the car roll into the lake. She originally thought about just ending her own life, but she figured it'd be better for her kids to be with her in heaven rather than on earth without a mother. But at some point, she changed her mind. She stepped out of the car right at the edge of the water and let it roll into the lake with her kids still inside. Maybe she was thinking about what Tom said about her kids. Maybe it was just a momentary lapse in judgment. Maybe this was her plan all along. But it didn't matter now, because all she could do was sit there and watch as the car floated out to the center of the lake and sank beneath the surface. After Susan confessed, police immediately sent a dive team out to John D. Long Lake in order to find the bodies. And it didn't take long for the media to figure out what was going on, why they were searching the lake. Now, keep in mind, Susan's confession is not public yet. It's stuff that only the police know. So at this point, they're thinking that the kids have still just been kidnapped. But when it was finally announced that Susan was the one who killed them, people were shocked. I mean, there's actually a clip of them announcing she's going to be arrested for the murder, and you could hear the people how shocked they are. Hold on, let me play it for you.
Susan Smith has been arrested and will be charged with 2 counts of murder in connection with the deaths of her children, Michael 3 and Alexander 14 months.
Susan ended up being handed down a life sentence, and her first parole hearing is going to be at the end of this year, so like November or December. Personally, I do not think they should let this woman out of prison. I mean, even if you take into account all the stuff that happened to her in her past, I just don't think it's enough to warrant cutting that sentence short. But if for whatever reason they decide to release her, we've got to keep her away from kids, because apparently she's been talking about what a great stepmom she would be. And according to one source, I highly doubt that. But to tell you the truth, Susan Smith getting released is the least of my worries. If they let this last guy out of prison, I genuinely might leave the country. It's 1977, and for the last 2 years, a killer has been terrorizing the streets of New York City. Shootings in Brooklyn, the Bronx, Queens, all committed with the same weapon, all still unsolved. Almost every single one of the victims was a woman with long, dark hair. People were so afraid of becoming the next target that they were cutting their hair, dyeing their hair, even buying wigs just to protect themselves. Because the truth is, Police still had no idea who this killer was. But they knew one thing for sure. He was going to kill again. What you're looking at here is part of a letter that was left behind by the killer at one of his crime scenes. And this thing's like 4 pages. There's some pretty disturbing stuff in here, like stuff that I wouldn't feel comfortable reading out loud. It would make me physically sick. But I am gonna go over some of the important parts with you. So the first thing is that he calls himself the Son of Sam. And this kind of becomes his iconic nickname. Sam, to him, is this demon that's possessing him and making him do these killings. He says he's been programmed to kill. And he even implies that he doesn't want to be doing this, but he has to because he's possessed. He says, "I don't want to kill anymore, but I must honor thy father." Presumably the father being this Sam, this demon that's possessing him. And of course, at the end of the letter, he says, "I'll be back, I'll be back," implying that he was going to kill again. And he did. In July of 1977, the NYPD had 70 detectives working full-time on this case, like literally doing nothing else except trying to catch this one guy. He had killed 5 people, injured 10 more, and just sent a threatening letter to a newspaper implying that he was going to kill on the anniversary of when his whole spree started, which was the end of July, July 29th. But in reality, his next killing didn't happen until a couple days later, and it ended up being the one that got him caught. Police had set up a pretty sizable perimeter leading up to the anniversary of the first shooting. They were mainly focused on stationing officers in areas where the killer had already been before. If you look at the map, you can kind of see where they've all been clustered. But July 29th, the exact day of the anniversary, passed without incident. Still, police and members of the public were nervous that something was going to happen, so they kept extra officers stationed in Queens and the Bronx. But the Son of Sam was already on the move, and he was in Brooklyn. Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violente were on a first date that night. Earlier in the evening, they had gone to watch a movie, and afterwards, they decided to drive over to Dyker Beach Park to spend some alone time together. Apparently, there was a road near there that was popular for that specific reason. It was dimly lit by streetlights, and for the most part, people wouldn't come around if they already saw a car parked there. But after that night, no one would ever want to go back to that spot. As the couple sat in the car, they were so focused on each other that they didn't even notice the man creeping up behind them. He walked around to the passenger's side window, crouched down, and immediately fired 4 rounds into the car. Both victims were shot in the head. Robert slammed on his horn and screamed out for help as blood was pouring down his face. And the killer, he just walked away from the scene of the crime calmly. It was disturbing. It was almost as if he was possessed, like he had no idea what he just did, or that he didn't care who saw him do it. Everybody in the area that heard the shots go off started frantically calling 911 because they knew what just happened. The Son of Sam had just killed again. When police arrived at the scene of the crime, they once again found very little evidence, and the witness reports they did have weren't exactly helpful either. They all matched the general description of the Son of Sam killer, but nobody was able to be specific enough, except for one woman, Cecilia Davis. She lived about a block or 2 away from where the killings actually took place, and just before the shots were fired, she saw a man removing a parking ticket from his car. This is the actual parking ticket right here. So she reported what she saw to the police, and they were able to narrow it down to everybody that got a ticket in that area that night. And finally, they found someone that matched the description perfectly. His name was David Berkowitz. As police arrived outside of David's apartment in Yonkers, they were careful not to draw too much attention to themselves. They didn't want everybody in the area knowing what was going on, especially not David. The first thing they did was look inside of his car. Through the window, they could see a handgun sitting in the back seat. Now, this wasn't the same kind of handgun that was used in the crimes, but police did use it as probable cause in order to search David's car. And inside of it, they found some interesting things. First, they found a ton of ammunition. They also found detailed maps of where all of the shootings took place, and they even found another letter that appeared to be in the exact same handwriting as the ones they had found before. Now, I want to be clear. police didn't have a warrant to search David's car. And because the gun in the back seat wasn't the one used in the crime, and it was legal to own in New York City, they technically searched the car without probable cause. They searched it illegally, which means that any evidence they did find could later be ruled as inadmissible in court. But that won't end up mattering, and I'll explain why later. At this point, the police were pretty sure they had their guy, so they waited outside his apartment all day. The plan was to catch him when he was trying to get into his car. They thought about ambushing him inside his apartment, but this was a violent guy. They didn't know what he would do to get out of that situation, and they didn't want to put themselves in a firefight if they didn't have to. At around 10 p.m. that night, David Berkowitz finally left his apartment, and by the time he got in his car, he was surrounded by cops, all with their guns drawn, pointed at him. One of the officers walked up to his driver's side window and pressed the gun directly against his temple. All David did was look up at him and smile, saying, "Well, you finally got me. Now what took you so long?" I mentioned earlier that it wouldn't be a huge problem for police if some of that evidence they found in David's car got thrown out. And that's because David actually ended up confessing within 30 minutes of his interrogation, to literally all of the shootings, by the way. And he also told investigators that he was planning on pleading guilty. Then a few weeks later, he went to the press and admitted that his whole demon possession thing, that was all a hoax. And he just didn't expect it to get picked up in the media the way that it did. So David was sentenced to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 25 years. And during the time that he's been in there, some pretty interesting stuff has come out of it. I mean, the main thing is this website. He became an evangelical Christian, and a church group set up a website for him called ariseandshine.org. You can actually go to this site and look through it yourself. But I looked through it, and I mean, there's some interesting stuff on there. There is a full apology for what he did. I mean, it's not very long, but it kind of covers everything. He's got a testimony about his life, how he ended up where he did, and the whole thing just kind of presents himself as somebody that has been reformed by the prison system, somebody that knows what they did was wrong and is kind of living out their sentence trying to become better, I guess. But probably the most interesting thing to me, at least that I was able to find when I was searching this site, is this blog post where he talks about how he isn't actively seeking parole. Now, this is from all the way back in 2016, so it is a little bit dated, but he references the transcript from his parole hearing that year, where they ask him if he thinks he's dangerous or at risk of reoffending, and he says, quote, "I feel I am no risk whatsoever." Then he goes on to clarify, "My criminal past was a terrible tragedy. I really didn't come here to seek parole." So it seemed like he was just kind of going there to air out his grievances, explain that he knew what he did was wrong and that he feels like he should serve out the rest of his sentence. Apparently, in recent years, that opinion has changed. It's no longer, "I'm not actively seeking parole." It's more, "I'm gonna be fine either way, but I wouldn't mind the chance to reassimilate into society." His next parole hearing is scheduled for this year, May 2024. And when that happens, I guess we'll see how it goes. You know, at the beginning of this story, I said that if they let David out of prison, that I was gonna leave the country. And to be honest, that was most definitely an overreaction. I was thinking about this David Berkowitz, the guy that was 24 years old, going on a rampage in New York City. I was not thinking about David Berkowitz, who's been in prison, who has seemed to be reformed, and is now like 70 years old. Let me check that before I say that. Yeah, he's 70 years old. I don't think that guy is going on a rampage anytime soon. Do I personally believe that's a good enough reason to let him out of prison? Honestly, no. I think letting him out now would only be an injustice to the families of the victims and all of the pain and trauma that he's caused for them. But I'm going to let you all, the jury, decide what you think.